Hey guys, Shovel the Kicking Turtle, and today I'm going to teach you on how to not get shit on in Competitive Heroes 2, but I must say, I'm not going to be talking about build orders, but I will be talking about how to play the faction, or at least a general strategy, idea, and some tactics you could use to play the game. So without any more rambling, let's get right into the video. First thing I should mention is how to get better at micromanaging. This is mainly for new players, but a general idea is use the minimap and use key bindings. The key bindings shown on screen are possibly the most important, and I'll explain what they do and how to use them a bit more, but this part of the video is mainly going to be talking about how useful the minimap is and how you should be using it. Now, the minimap is useful in a variety of reasons. The biggest one is that it lets you maneuver the camera around a lot easier than going on the side of the screen. And I'd argue it's even better than using WASD, which you can rebind, but it's really complicated because it's gay. Company Heroes 2 is a little gay. In fact, this game is really gay, but it is really complicated to rebind your keys to WASD, so I'd recommend just using the minimap. It's easier and is possibly more efficient. So aside from that, I'm pretty sure most of you guys know how to use key bindings for abilities in the bottom right. If you don't know, it'll show you. And one other little minor thing I should mention is in the top right, you basically got these icons, and don't have a little target mark on them. They're not in combat, or if they do, they are in combat. I think I worded that really gaily. But my point is, you could double click on these if you want to get to a point. You can also bind them to keys if you hold Control 1 or any of the control. If you hold Control and push a number, you basically bind it to that number. That's very useful with vehicles. In my opinion, I mainly use them for vehicles. That's pretty much about it, and or snipers and support teams. But anyways, that's something to keep in mind while you're playing the game to help you micromanage a little bit better. So then for the last thing about micromanagement is you can actually make multiple orders for infantry and tanks, but this is mainly useful for infantry. And what I'm saying is, if you hold shift and you right click on the map, you keep doing this just as long as you hold shift and you keep right clicking on the map, it gives your units multiple orders to follow. And this is really useful for capturing points, especially in the early game and in the late game when you're kind of busy micromanaging elsewhere and you just want to capture stuff. You just right click on the little dinger or the little point, and you right click another point and you start capturing more points. It's also really good for repairing vehicles. You could get one group of engineers to repair this one tank and then move to the next tank and then move to the next tank. It's really useful. I'd recommend using it throughout your entire game. So the game basically plays like this. You have two sides. They both start at 500 victory points. There are 3 objectives on the map. If you control 2, the other side ticks down. If you control all 3, every second a victory point ticks down. So you basically want to triple cap as much as possible. So there are technically 5 resources in the game. The first one being manpower, the second one being munitions, third one being fuel, the fourth one being population, and the fifth one being victory points. I'll be referring to victory points as VPs for the rest of the video because it's really gay and difficult to say victory points back to back. So in order to get resources, you need to capture strategic points in the map. Now, strategic points, I'm going to be referring to them just as points because it's easier to say. But anyways, each point will give you 5 munitions, 3 fuel. There are fuel points and munition points. Munition points grants 11, fuel points grant 7. And one thing to note is they all have to be connected in order to accumulate these resources. And a good way to tell if you're getting these resources is to hover above a point and see if there's a number next to the point. If there is a number next to the point, that means you're getting the resources. If there's not, you're probably not going to be getting those resources. Another way to check this is the strategic map mode, but you just push numpad 0 or just in the bottom leftish of the screen, click that, and you'll see if things are connected or not. That's also a good way to see how to connect points and to see what is connected. Now with this knowledge, there's a thing called a cutoff point in just about every map. It's on both sides, it's for both sides, and if you capture it or decapture it, it basically cuts off resources to you or your enemy, and you want to apply a lot of pressure to these points because, well, it cuts off resources, and resources are extremely important for weapon upgrades and getting tanks and technology up and ready. So if you can get these points, however long you can hold it, you basically deny your enemy of resources. Now there are 3 really big mechanics that go hand in hand, and that is retreating, veterancy, and healing. And now retreating, you really only want to do is when your squad is about to die. You retreat because it gives them a huge defensive bonus and they haul ass back to base. So you're going to want to retreat when they're about to die. But why do you want to retreat? Well, if you retreat and they make it back to base safely, they basically get veterancy points. If you go down to the bottom left of the portrait, it shows you there are these little veterancy stars. If you hover above it, it'll tell you what they do, but the general idea is if they're Vet 3, they are an amazing killing machine, and you want to keep them alive as much as possible, because when somebody starts losing their Vet 5 or Vet 3 squads, then you can start to see who's going to start winning the game, because whoever has the most vetted up squads are usually going to be the one winning the game. Now, healing isn't really that complicated. It's basically you select the units at base and you push R and they basically reinforce themselves. But I did want to say there is a unique way just about in every faction on how they heal. Some of them are a little different, some of them are very different, but basically the idea is Soviets, you could build a medical infirmary, or at least upgrade it in the main base. It's right here. The Wehrmacht or the Oster, fuck you. The Oster, they basically build a bunker and they have to upgrade it with medical HQ medic kids, and they get to heal themselves from there. The United States forces, they have to build a ambulance and they have to set it up. It's mobile, they can reinforce from it, it's very useful. The Oberkommando, they have to build a battle group and upgrade it with medical HQ officer kids, basically medics. And the British, they basically have mobile medics, they just have to make sure that they upgrade them with the medic packs after getting the first tier. So now we come to one of the more complex and expansive parts of the video about infantry tactics. Now, infantry tactics, tank tactics, they're pretty much really big, so I'm not going to cover too much, but what I will cover is some basics that will probably help you. And one of the big basics is cover. Well, cover is amazing because, well, it makes you take less damage, you take less suppression, and your squad will usually live longer. Green cover's the best, red cover's the worst. Being in red cover basically makes your infantry squads a lot easier to hit, so you take more damage. And if they're in any other cover, well, they just take less damage, which is very useful if you want to get veterancy on your squads. I should also mention that the British get a pretty good bonus for being in cover. I don't know how to word it, but basically they fire faster and they were even harder to hit when they're in cover. So always be in cover, or at least try to be in cover as much as you can when dealing with other squads. So while being in cover is extremely powerful, then I'd highly recommend you actively seek to be in cover. There are situations where rushing into cover isn't quite the best idea, or at least the best thing to do, because there are two mechanics that can work against you, and these two mechanics are, for one, infantry squads cannot fire behind them, they can only shoot forward and side to side, and players can actually capitalize on this when you're rushing into cover because, well, for one, like I said, you can't shoot behind you, and this can actually be a huge kind of thing where infantry squads will rush towards you and they will not be taking any damage because your back is faced and your infantry squads are not dealing any damage to them, but they're getting basically free shots despite the aim penalty. They're getting free shots, and they could actually possibly out damage you before you get into cover to really turn the tide back around. And there's a little counter for this that I don't know what to call it, but I'll be calling it bracing, which is basically where when a squad is rushing towards you, instead of rushing into cover, you can actually just select your squad, push S to stop them from moving so they don't take an aim penalty, and while an enemy squad is rushing towards you to close the gap, you're basically getting some really good accurate shots while they're shooting inaccurate shots towards your squad, and they're taking a lot more damage compared to you, so you should be able to win that engagement just by the fact that you're dealing more damage to them. This is very useful when Soviet conscripts are charging towards you and your grenadiers are just trying to survive. I also thought I should mention that being in green cover outside of a house doesn't actually mean you're always in green cover. It just means most of the squad are in green cover. Meanwhile, if you're in a house, everyone in the squad's in green cover. The downside about a house is, for one, they take extra damage from fire weapons like flamethrowers and molotovs and incendiary grenades, and when they're limited to only firing out of windows. So if there is one window on one side and a rifleman squad is out there and your grenadier squad is in the house, only one grenadier is actually firing at that squad. So keep that in mind when attacking or being in a house. Sometimes it's more beneficial to just be outside the house instead of inside the house. Now this is just a reminder for a friend of mine, which is basically to always focus fire whenever possible. If you don't know how to do it, which I'm pretty sure you do, it's a popular in every strategy game there is. It's basically select just about as many units as you can that's in an area, and you focus fire on one unit by just right clicking or pushing A and left clicking, which is the best way to not get out of cover. If you don't want to get, like, if you right click you might miss the unit and you just push A and you left click and they'll just shoot them there. That usually, if it helps it a bit, makes it easier to not fuck up. But that's just something to keep in mind. Basically, focus fire, it's the best way to do things. So grenades are pretty straightforward. You throw them where you think the enemy's going to be or where they're going to stay, and it blows up or it just catches them on fire. But a little small tip for you is if someone's in a house, just try to predict where they'll exit the building, because some players like to dodge these grenades, and in some cases you can even wipe the squad if you do it right, or if they're too slow on their micromanagement skills. But basically what I'm trying to say is just aim at the doorway if you have the grenade and there's a guy in a house. So for infantry, the final thing I've really got to say is that, well, essentially all infantry squads are different. For example, conscripts are different from grenadiers, not just in unit size, but also in stats. For example, conscripts generally do better at closer ranges, while grenadiers are usually better at longer ranges. But that's not really what I wanted to talk about at this point. I really want to talk about equipment squads can have and how this should affect your decision making. But the general idea, which is really easy to understand, is basically PPSHs and other weapons like that. Automatic weapons deal better at closer ranges, while SKSs and M1 Garands basically deal better at medium to close range as well. But machine guns generally do better at longer range. That doesn't mean that they strictly do better at these ranges. It just, that's the general idea that you want them to be in. I don't want to make this a rule. I'm just trying to say it's a guideline to keep in mind when positioning your troops and fighting in engagements. Now I'll briefly touch on support guns, but the general idea is you got 4 types of support weapons. You got heavy machine guns, which are really good at suppressing infantry, and I'd recommend using them to lock down a map, or at least a point on the map, because they suppress infantry, and they're really great in buildings. But then there's mortars. Now mortars are generally good against entrenched enemies, mainly because, well, it's indirect fire. They also have a smoke ability, which can be very useful to close the gap on machine guns. It also bombards houses, so that people will eventually have to get outside the house when there's like a mortar bombarding them. It'll damage over time. It's not really a unit meant to kill as much as it's a unit meant to cause attrition damage. And then there's anti-tank guns, which I'd highly recommend you at least have one in every game you play, just because anti-tank guns are really good pretty much throughout the whole game, excluding the early game because it's infantry battles. But once the game starts to move from infantry to light vehicles or to medium and to heavy tanks, the anti-tank gun will be there pretty much the whole time. And anti-tank guns and tanks all have this ability called attack ground, which is essentially you can attack the ground of wherever you click. You just select attack ground and you push G, you left click on the map, and your tank or your anti-tank gun just starts shooting on the ground at that direction. Now, this is useful in like 3 or maybe even various ways, which the first 3 that I can remember is the first one, it could shoot through hedgerows or sight blockers, and it can actually hit tanks. It can shoot through smoke, which is very useful if the tank is like 1 HP away from death, and it can also shoot like outside the range of because you need sight sometimes to hit enemies, and you could just use attack ground to hit through the fog of war. This is useful for trying to snipe tanks retreating, or just attacking the British emplacements sometimes. And finally, you got snipers, which are just attrition units. Now, they're nothing to be scoffed at. They're actually pretty good, but I don't think I can really explain their whole use in just like 10 seconds. So I would recommend using snipers only if you know how to use them. So now we get into tanks, which is one of those topics that has a lot of factors to think about, and I'll try to cover as much as I can. So anyways, now we get into tanks. And tanks essentially have frontal armor and rear armor. Frontal armor acts as it bounces rounds off and it's harder to penetrate. The rear armor is easier to penetrate, and it deals more damage, obviously, because tanks have less armor in the back. Now you might be saying, Turtle, it's very obvious, but the Company Heroes 2 is a little different because there's no side armor, there's only front and back armor, which is why I'm explaining this. And anyways, probably I'm showing this picture, but it's basically shows the frontal and rear armor of tanks in Company of Heroes 2. So I should probably just call this the vehicle tactics, but tank tactics sounds better. But anyways, what I'm trying to say is that there are a couple different types of ways to use tanks and vehicles in general. The first one is usually to do a tactic that's called poking. Poking is essentially keeping your distance with your vehicle to avoid anti-tank grenades and snares, which are just anti-tank grenades, I should say. If an anti-tank grenade hits a light vehicle, it will immediately disable or at least damage the engine, which makes your vehicle go slower, and it's easier to hit with an anti-tank grenade. So essentially you're going to want to keep your distance with light vehicles. And if you're playing against the British, their infantry sections don't spawn with, or at least they don't have any form of anti-tank grenade unless they are the anti-tank boys or whatever. But the gist of what I'm trying to say is attack infantry squads that don't have anti-tank grenades. Like some factions, like I think the USF and the Oper Commando West don't have anti-tank grenades within 5 minutes of the game usually, and you can actually punish these factions really hard if you with your light vehicles, because you can just rush up to them and deal a huge amount of damage to their squads, especially if you have a Panzer II or something. But my point is, light vehicles, you need to keep in mind of snares of anti-tank grenades. Now, one huge tip I should really give you is to use the dedicated reverse button, which is just usually U on the default keys. But using U to reverse vehicles is extremely useful, especially if you don't want your vehicles to do some retarded shit where they just you try to push backwards, and they just do a 360 spin and they get destroyed by anti-tank guns. So it's a really good way to get good at poking as well, or at least it goes really well with poking, just because most machine guns, or at least most tanks and light tanks, just about everything, has a hull gunner, and the hull gunners almost always point forward, and you get more bang for your buck most of the time, is what I'm trying to say. So light tanks and medium tanks should just be used as sort of a defense unit. I'm not saying strictly, but for a general idea on how to use them, I'd recommend just using them as to defend the whole map from back capping, because tanks generally can go toe to toe with infantry just as like one single infantry squad, and sometimes even two. But what I'm trying to say here is that tanks can be used to defend the map from people back capping, but they can also be used to support your infantry. You could do this by flanking enemy machine guns. My point is, I would recommend just using light tanks to kind of defend the whole map while also supporting infantry when it can with flanks, or with just being there, because light tanks can actually provide a lot of support. They have a lot of utility, but the general idea I would recommend to use them for is to defend the whole map while giving flanking support for your infantry. So heavy tanks, well, they're pretty much damage sponges, but they can be used in a couple different ways. It can be kind of used in medium tank fashion if they're like a Tiger, a regular Tiger, and a Pershing. But if there's something like a Crocodile or just Churchill or a King Tiger, I would advise using them to be lock down a middle point, just because they have huge amounts of armor and they could generally go toe to toe with infantry. And most heavy tanks like the King Tiger can actually go toe to toe with all the tanks, just as long as they're within range. And I say they have to be within range because tank destroyers actually have the most range in the game in terms of anti-tank stuff. They are mobile and they're great, but tank destroyers are usually countered by medium tanks, which can flank them, and medium tanks are actually countered by heavy tanks because if they're just standing in front of them without any flanking. But in all honesty, the general idea for this game is about positioning, support, and positioning and support. Actually, the game is just about positioning and supporting your units, but just about everything I've said can actually just be dismissed in a way, just because, like I said, the game is about supporting and positioning your units. But what I mean by this is that if you can support your infantry with anti-tank guns, then you really don't need to worry about tanks destroying your infantry. Or if your machine guns has supported by infantry, you don't need to worry about getting flanked. It's just that. And if positioning works even better, because if your machine guns in a house, then your positioning is that you can't be flanked generally. And if you got some enemy tanks rushing down towards you and you got them in a choke point, your positioning is spot on. But what I'm trying to say here is that I don't want to say there are no hard counters, because, well, people can micromanage out of your hard counter into support, and they can kill your hard counter. Like a Panzer II falling back to to anti-tank guns and infantry ready to Panzerfaust a Stuart. It's just all about supporting and luring and baiting and all this shit. Honestly, if you really want to get better at this game, I'd highly recommend checking out Helping Hands, as he's a pro player and he has like hour videos talking about mines and whatnot, and I didn't even get to cover mines. Like, I want to, or I probably will. If I did cover mines, it's probably because I wasn't lazy and I added it in last minute. But mines are really important in this game, and Helping Hands covers like an hour worth of it. Like, it covers a lot of it. But only problem about Helping Hands is that, well, he kind of goes on for an hour about talking about stuff most people would know. But anyways, yeah, this video is about 20 minutes now, and I hope you guys enjoyed. I want to be making more Competitive Heroes 2 videos, but I'm a bit lazy. This took me about 2 weeks to make. I'm gay, fuck you.